Hey guys, Rebecca from Changing Childhoods here. I was watching a video the other day with Mackenzie Price from 2 Hour Learning Alpha School, and I just thought, this is really an interesting topic to delve into a little bit. Now, Mackenzie Price started a school, which then became, I guess, multiple schools, and she, I believe, wrote a book. Her premise is that all of the academics can be done in 2 hours a day. And she uses AI, adaptive individualized learning. Okay, AI, artificial intelligence, but adaptive individualized learning for those 2 hours. And then the students spend the rest of their school day learning life skills, which would be financial literacy, public speaking, entrepreneurship, and then, other things that they're interested in. So I was thinking about this from a Charlotte Mason perspective, in the sense that Charlotte Mason, in my opinion, is pretty timeless in her understanding of what education is and what people are. Okay, that has never changed, really. So, and probably never will, as far as, what it means to be educated, how the mind works, what a person is. And so her principles are very rooted in more of a philosophical approach. Okay. And obviously, well, maybe not obviously if you don't know who she is, but at her time, we didn't have computers. We really didn't have AI. We didn't even have computers. We didn't have, telephones were new. So the technology has changed tremendously in the last 100 years. So I thought this is really an interesting kind of a meeting of minds, if you could put them together, right? And I wouldn't doubt that they may disagree on a lot of things and also agree on a lot of things. And I won't pretend to speak for either of them by any means, but I thought it'd be just an interesting conversation to have. Okay. So, from what I understand, the schools that she is forming, are using AI to have each child work for about 2 hours a day on, reading and, language arts and math, and science, I believe history also. I couldn't quite find exactly which subjects are in that 2 hours, but I know at least those are. Okay. And they're working through a computer using adaptive learning. So they're not just working through a curriculum, they're working through something that's responsive to them. And then it's like challenging them at their level. So whether they're behind or advanced, whatever those terms mean, they can work from the level that they're at and they can progress with, an adaptive model, which I think is actually super cool, right? And I'm not a big technology person and I avoid screens and avoid screens for my kids as much as I can. But like she said in one of the interviews I saw with her, like, this isn't mindless scrolling. This isn't addictive sort of stuff. This is like using technology in probably the best way that we can to help kids learn. Now, having said that, I have a lot of questions about what it actually looks like and what the kids are actually learning, but I'll talk about a little bit more about that in a minute. I thought it was also interesting how many similarities I saw between her model and the Acton schools, because the Acton schools have really taken off, I guess, in the last, I don't think they're more than 10 years old. And I think there's several hundred of them around, but they're very much about this like hero's journey. And the students start with like setting their own goals. What do they want to accomplish that day? It's very like learner driven. They call them learners. The teachers are guides. She also calls her teachers guides. Acton puts multiple ages together. They have a pretty set like way that they do their schools. But it's about this hero's journey, but they also use technology for, like, they use Khan Academy and that kind of thing for a little bit of time in the morning, I believe, for the kids to do their math and all of that. I think that Acton allows the children to choose what they do and how they do it more so, from what I'm understanding. I could be wrong in that. But that's how they start with a meeting where the kids set goals for themselves, and then they spend some time using technology to learn some of the academic skills, and then they like set goals and they do entrepreneurship and projects and all of that kind of thing. Okay, so I thought there's a lot of similarities, what she was describing. Now, I got the impression that some of the other schools she started, there's emphasis on different types of projects. So I think she has one that focuses a lot on sports, another that's like gaming. So this would be like the afternoon time, the rest of the time. of the school day, because I heard her say a couple of times, like parents don't send their kids to school and then want them back home after 2 hours, even though they've learned everything that they needed to learn academically. They want them to be in school all day because of the childcare aspect, which I agree with. That's usually true. And she said, and I was thinking like, well, homeschoolers have known for a long time that it only takes a couple hours to learn the basic academic knowledge that's conveyed throughout a school day. Homeschoolers have known that for a long time. So I'm not surprised by that part. Because when you sit down with a child and you do the academics at their level, like a homeschooler does, you basically do the same thing. It's your own private adaptive tutor, individualized adaptive tutor. You're just not using artificial intelligence. So it was very interesting, the format of the day, and it reminded me a lot of the Acton schools. Okay. So then I thought, well, what would Charlotte Mason say? Now, Charlotte Mason was pretty cutting edge. She liked science. She liked technology, what existed of it at the time. She was always reading about the newest, philosophies and the brain science. And, it was kind of a new thing at the time, I believe, when she was writing the idea of tracks in your brain, like actual physical tracks that are built in your brain when you think certain thoughts. So she found that very fascinating. She talks about habit development, and she how that actually wears down a place in your brain, the neurons in your brain, to create new habits and all of that, which was new science at the time. She was very up on that sort of thing. And now we look at the books she used in her schools and we're like, oh, those are so old fashioned, but at the time they weren't, and I'm pretty positive that she would have been all about keeping up with whatever the newest information in science and, research and all of that, and keeping up with whatever was coming out as far as research, as long as it was actually well researched and it was in keeping with those fundamental unchanging principles of personhood and the spirit. She talks about the spirit of the child, but the personhood is all part of that. And then there's no education except self-education. In those ways, I think she was, she would be very much in agreement with some of these models that encourage self-education, because it's not truly education if the child is just regurgitating back some facts that they have to know for a test and then they forget it all. That she wouldn't say that that's education. And I don't think, Mackenzie Price or the founder of Acton or any of the people who are into the learner-driven models would say that you're really truly educated if that's all that your education involves. So I think those are some ways that she would agree. Another interesting thing that she mentioned, by the way, that has to do with, it reminded me of Charlotte Mason's principles, was she talked about using the Pomodoro technique, which is I think it's fairly well known as you just really focus and you work in a 25-minute block. I think this is for adults. A 25-minute block, you just set time for 25 minutes and you work really hard for 25 minutes and then you take a 5-minute break and you just go do something else. I think Charlotte Mason would have loved this model because she talks a lot about short lessons and building the habit of attention, and how, for a child, you do really short lessons. You just start them with 5 minutes, then you let them go do something else, and then you bring them back again, and then you build it up to 10, 15, 20, so that by the time they're in upper elementary and middle school, they're doing maybe 30 or 40 minutes lesson times, but you get the best out of them for 10 or 15 minutes, and that's much better than, an hour long. It takes a long time to get to the point and they're doing the same thing for all this time and you're not being able to do anything else. Okay. So Mackenzie Price also talks about that and how efficient that is. Okay. So I thought that was interesting. I think that's something that they would agree on. But to get back to what my question was I was like, well, I would have to see exactly what this is resulting in. What is the child putting out in these AI models? And I would have to see them in action to know, because, Charlotte Mason was very much about the ideas and the language in the narration. Okay. Because of the ideas, because we're humans and we speak and we communicate ideas through language, books that were well written was the best way, to convey ideas. And then the child gravels with those ideas, thinks about those ideas and absorbs those ideas and then puts them back out through narration in their own words. And she very much believed that was where education happens, in that action. Okay. I suspect that an adaptive learning sort of thing might lean a lot more into still I don't want to say regurgitating, and I don't want to, because I really don't know, but being able to know the facts of something, and now you know the facts, and the computer sees that you know the fact, and now you can move on to the next thing. Okay. Especially, and I personally am kind of okay with that, with like math and maybe like grammar and even like the basics of phonics. Like you either know the sound or you don't know the sound, you know. But ultimately you need to be able to apply those things. So, you know, there's just a few years where you have to learn the basics of phonics, but ultimately you just need to be able to read, right? But some things like, you know, maybe the rules of grammar, spelling, and then like math, I think, well, you can either do the problem or you can't. You know, you either know what a noun is or you don't. And I still have a bit of a hard time grasping, having young kids grasp the ideas behind that stuff. Although Charlotte Mason, to be fair, she didn't introduce grammar and that kind of thing until the kids were older anyway. And she taught spelling and phonics through more of a holistic way. Grammar was and through like copy work of actual full passages. So she was consistent within herself for sure. But I kind of am like, well, I think it's fine for kids to like, which I guess I differ from Charlotte Mason on this, like to do like flashcards for phonics for a year or two, because then they just learn it and then they learn to read and it just clicks in their brain. And I think there's a lot of scientific, brain research that backs that up. And even for math, I think sometimes there's certain minds who just aren't going to grasp the ideas behind math until they're a little older. So no matter how many times you explain it to the math to a child, the idea behind why the math is like it is, sometimes younger children, they might be able to do it, but they can't really understand it why until later. Some kids can, but I think other kids, they just need a little more abstract thinking skills before they can get there. So anyway, it's my little side note on that. But I would be curious to see how that AI learning works with that. I suspect that I think it would be pretty effective for some of those skills that have to build on each other. But I also suspect that I personally, and probably Charlotte Mason too, wouldn't be as impressed with it as far as like history and science. Okay. Fact acquisition, sure. But actually grappling with the ideas and understanding the ideas, I probably wouldn't really agree with that part of it. Okay. But as a comparison to what maybe public schools are doing, or any kind of school that's just like teaching to a test, to teaching facts, and there's a reason to know facts, maybe, but like, what does it matter if you can't actually apply it, or it means nothing to you? Yeah. But as a comparison to taking the entire day to learn a few things so that you can regurgitate them on a test and then forget them, certainly more efficient, it sounds like. Okay. But is a comparison to really grappling with the ideas of history and being exposed to a lot of good books and narrating back, I suspect that I wouldn't be too impressed with it as far as history and science and music and all of that. Now, as far as the rest of the day, the entrepreneurship and public speaking and financial literacy and emphasis on learning practical skills, I think a lot of that, Charlotte Mason wanted the children to be spending afternoons working on practical skills, handicrafts, and that kind of thing. She was very much in support of that. She called them handicrafts. I like to broaden the term a little bit to just say things that are practical for life that you have to learn how to do and actually be creative and, to have some agency and like, creating a business or a project or learning a skill with your hands or whatever. Okay. So I think, what does that look like in modern times? It might mean, computer, I don't know, coding or whatever. I don't know anything about computer coding, but, that sort of skill, creativity, or art design or graphic design, or, it's certainly financial literacy and public speaking and entrepreneurship. I think every child should learn some basics of that, and they probably don't really in most schools. So I thought that was like, kind of cool. And I think Acton does some of that too. Now, I would say that because Charlotte Mason was, education is a life and an atmosphere and discipline. I think that discipline part of it, she leaned more towards the adult helping the children with the discipline of the learning than like an Acton school would do. Probably, I think for sure, because it's more learner driven. And I haven't seen one of those in action. I would like to do that. We do have one nearby. I want to go watch it in action. But from all the interviews and everything that I've seen in the videos, it's less disciplined from the adult telling the children what to do when, for sure. And I'm not exactly sure how Mackenzie Price's schools look as far as like, now it's time to sit down and do this, for the day. I think it's also more learner driven. One other thing that I thought was that got me thinking was in our Charlotte Mason hybrid, we have grades in our program, but these other models are leaning more toward like multi-age, which I think is great. But one of the problems that you run into if you have a teacher trying to teach skills-based subjects and you have multiple levels in your room is how do you do that, right? How do you teach kids who are at differing levels of math and reading, especially significantly different levels, when it's just one teacher and 10 or 15 or 20 kids and they're at different levels. It's hard to do that with the skills. You can do it with history books and science books and nature study and art and music. There's a whole bunch of the day you can do together, and it doesn't matter. But it does matter for those skills. So my brainstorming mind went off with like, if you could adapt, an AI sort of individual, and this is again assuming that the AI is good, and I'd have to see it in action, but it's actually programmed to be based on well researched, skills that are actually going to be teaching the kids what they actually need to learn, and it's not just like pulling from who knows where to give the kids information. This is assuming that it's quality stuff that's based in really good research and really actually accurate information. If you could use an adaptive, individualized sort of learning for skills like math and, maybe some basic phonics, maybe some spelling, I would say for those like 3 things, maybe a little bit of grammar when the kids are older. If you could use that in a classroom that was like, especially like a Charlotte Mason hybrid, and I say hybrid because that's what I'm familiar with, but also because in a hybrid, you only have the children a couple of days a week. And because of that, you also have that added, like, they're doing different things at home. So they might be progressing at different rates also because of that reason. So that can kind of add another like complication to like progressing at the same rate because you only have the kids part-time, which is why I encourage to just use a curriculum and assign it for home for those skills-based subjects so the kids are moving along at the same pace. But if you use something that's adaptive and individualized and on computer, the parents could be using it at home just for those subjects. I would say just for those subjects and at school. Or just at school while the parents are doing what they're doing at home, because if it's adaptive, they can just pick up where the child is from their work at home. And they just keep progressing on the days that they're at school for like, those subjects. And then you could put multiple ages together and the teacher wouldn't have to try to individualize, and the kids wouldn't be held back or behind or whatever. They could just move through that stuff. Now, there comes a point, usually around 3rd grade where you're moving the whole group into like maybe reading aloud or whatever. And if the kid can't read yet, there comes a point where it does kind of become a problem for the rest of the day if the child usually is reading. If they can't read or write and you want them to do reading and writing starting in 3rd or 4th grade with class, then that can cause a bit of tension for sure. But most kids are learning how to read and write by 3rd grade if they're consistently working. Okay. Or 4th grade for sure. But then if you use that, hybrid model, for those subjects, and then you spent some time with the group with books and narration for history and, science, doing hands-on real things, being outside in nature, looking at real art and listening to music and reading biographies. And, especially as the kids are getting older, having discussions. You can't do that with AI, to the effect of like the whole class is sitting together talking about this idea, like reading about the Greeks and why democracy and all of that was, foundational to Western civilization and our American government. And I can't imagine how it could ever be as good at working with AI to learn your history that way as it would be to read the books and then discuss it, especially as the kids get into like high school and stuff. And just like tell it back and build those ideas. Okay. But even not, you can easily spend an hour, maybe a little over an hour on the skills-based things with computer, perhaps. And then you spend an hour or 2 talking about history and science and art and music with books and discussion. And then you would still have some time in the day to focus on entrepreneurship and maybe project-based learning where the kids are creating their own things, public speaking, and those things that Mackenzie Price talks about in her schools, that some of what Acton does, that kind of thing, you'd still have some time for that. Okay. So I was brainstorming what that could look like to adapt a Charlotte Mason hybrid to that kind of technology and a little bit of that model. And you could really, I think, divide your day kind of into thirds, and you could adapt it to some degree and still stay true to a lot of the Charlotte Mason principles, most of them, but also use technology to its advantage and remove that burden from the teacher for having to teach skill-based subjects. If we combine ages together, which from an entrepreneurial founder's perspective, sometimes you don't have enough kids to fill every single grade, depending on where you live, or you just maybe don't have enough space to have a classroom for every grade, or that's just not the model that you want. You could easily have 2 classes of 15 kids, but they're multi-age. You might have 6 through 9-year-olds in one group and 9 through 12-year-olds in another group, and they can all work through those skills on their own, hit their own pace through the adaptive learning, but then they can all read together, narrate together, discuss together, and project together. You could do it without having to worry about how many kids are at each, smaller level of reading, writing, and math. So anyway, just a little brainstorm if you like that sort of thing. And I think it's super fascinating, the different models that are coming out. I don't agree with all of them, but I think I like to see people answering the call, answering the gap, the need for doing something different than what the traditional schools, traditional in the sense that the last 100 years or so, have been doing, because people know it's not working. So I like to see the creative ideas and, the competition in the market for they're doing it this way and it's kind of cool, but I don't think it's quite what I want. And then this other school's doing it this way. It's like my favorite thing, my combination of economics and education. So anyway, hopefully you found that discussion interesting, maybe spark some ideas for you. Let me know if it did. And we will see you again soon. Make sure you subscribe and keep your eyes open for any other videos. I come across stuff like this sometimes and just like to talk. So